Okay, the kidneys are a major excretory organ. It's going to be responsible for regulating the water volume and total solute concentration of the urine or water. It's going to ensure a long-term acid-base balance. It's going to get rid of metabolic waste, toxins, and drugs. And it's also going to produce erythropoietin, which will regulate blood pressure, and renin, which will regulate red blood cell production. In addition to activating vitamin D and carrying out gluconeogenesis, which is the production of new glucose molecules, for the most part, everything that we're going to talk about begins with the letter U. So the ureters is a tube that goes from the kidney to the urinary bladder. The urinary bladder is a storage reservoir for urine until it's convenient to go urinate. And the urethra is the tube that goes from the bladder to outside of the body. One of the things I want to point out is the right kidney is always a little bit lower than the left, although you can't really see it well on that picture. When I go to the back here, you can kind of see that this side, which is the right, is lower than the left. And the reason for that is the the liver is going to push it down somewhat. Just because you got everything squished in there, you can kind of see there is the two kidneys on either side of the abdomen in the back, and from it is going to be the ureter that will go from the kidney down into the bladder, and then in this female here, from the bladder outside in the U-tube, which is called the urethra. So that's basically it, and we're going to talk pretty much about three things. One is going to be creating urine and how you get it out of the body. And the second one is going to be the blood flow into the kidney and out of the kidney. And the third one is going to be how all of that is going to be accomplished in the kidney with all of the parts. So let's just go to the kidney. Although you're not getting to dissect the kidney, it has a lot of fascia around it. It really looks like spider webs that are holding it in place. You are going to have a fat capsule around kidneys. That's to protect it. It's a cushion. And the kidney itself does have a fibrous capsule that is going to prevent things from going into it or out of it, so that you don't want to spread infection to the kidney or from the kidney. The best way to teach this is to see that the kidney is shaped, believe it or not, like a kidney bean. I always ask that question and not everyone gets it right. But if you look at this light brown all the way around, that's going to be the cortex of it. The lighter, or the more mahogany looking middle section, is going to be the renal medulla. Medulla in Latin means middle, and that's all it really means, is we're going to have a cortex all the way around it, and we're going to have these kind of look like triangles here, and the medulla is going to be the middle of it. If you look at this thing here, here is cortical material that has invaginated between these two medullas here. And there's one here between this one and that one. And so that portion of it is called the renal column. So here is the cortex, a renal column between the two pyramids, another renal column between the two pyramids, and that's basically what you need to know. The other thing that I'm going to mention is at the pointy part of each pyramid is called the renal papilla. So the renal papilla is an opening here, and the fluid that secretes out of it is called urine. So the first thing that you need to know is that as you filter blood through here, as the fluid comes out here, this is the first time it's called urine. Prior to that, everything that's going through this is going to be called blood filtrate. So to make it really simple, at the end of each one of these papillas or pyramids is going to be a little cup. I kind of think of it as a bathroom Dixie cup. Calyx in Latin means cup. So the minor calyx here is just as this is dripping through here, you're accumulating urine. When you finally fill up the bathroom Dixie cup or the minor calyx, it's going to overflow into this area here, which is called the major calyx, which means it's kind of like a kitchen Dixie cup. So we've filled up the minor calyx to fill up the major calyx, and as it creates urine, you are then going to fill it up more in this space here, which is called the renal pelvis. Once you have accumulated enough urine, it is then going to go into this tube here, which is called the ureter. The ureter will go down to your bladder, and as you're accumulating urine, you are going to store it in your bladder. They actually have, somewhere here they have the flow chart. So the flow chart would be the renal pyramid, and at the end of the pyramid is going to be the papilla. And as it goes through there, it goes into the minor calyx, which is the smaller cup. As that fills up, it's going to overflow into a bigger cup, which is going to be the major calyx. As that fills up, it's going to go into the renal pelvis, which will then empty into the ureter, which will then have all of it empty into the urinary bladder. Once you've reached a point where you can't hold it anymore, you're going to have the urge to urinate as long as you've been potty trained. So once you have the urine and it's stored in the bladder, then provided you've been potty trained, you can then urinate conveniently. So that's going to be the first thing that you need to know. You need to know the parts of the kidney that will, so this would be the minor calyx right at the end of each one of these papilla in the pyramid. Then it's going to overflow into the major calyx. Here's one here, here's another one here, and then that's going to overflow into this renal pelvis, which will then go down this tube, and this tube will end up going into the bladder. So that's the first thing that you need to know. When does urine first start? And it's going to be at the end of the papilla in the pyramid, and we're going to collect it in the minor calyx, or the minor or the smaller cup. Then it'll go into the major cup, which is the major calyx, which will then go into the renal pelvis, which will then go into the ureter, which will then go into the urinary bladder, which will then come out of your body through the urethra. When we get to talk about the reproductive system, you'll see there's a major difference between the urethra of a female versus the urethra of a male. And we'll talk about that in our male reproductive portion. The second thing that you need to know is the blood flow, and this particular book shows you a great way to learn it, and it's right here. So it's a flow chart. So if you remember back when I used Ben as a way to go from place to place to place, Ben would go from the aorta into the renal artery, into the segmental artery, into the artery between the two lobes, which is going to be by definition interlobar artery. Then it's going to arc over the top of the pyramid. That's called the arcuate artery. And then it's going to radiate into the cortex, and that artery is called the cortical radiate artery. Then it's going to go into and out of the glomerulus. It's going to go into the afferent arteriole, which is a little bit larger than the efferent, into the glomerulus, which is a tuft of capillaries, and then we're going to have a return trip going back. So we're going to go out of the glomerulus as you filter the blood, because that's what's going through it, blood filtrate, into the efferent arteriole. We're going to avoid the purple right now, into the cortical radiate vein, into the arcuate vein, into the interlobar vein. There is no segmental vein, as you'll notice, and it goes right from the interlobar vein into the renal vein, which would then go into the inferior vena cava, which would bring you back to the right atrium. So here's what it looks like in the picture, and this is what I would ask you, what is this? So it's coming in through the renal artery. Then you can kind of see these two segments are going to be the segmental artery. Then it's going to branch off in between these two lobes. So these are called the interlobar artery because it's between the two lobes. Then it's going to arc over the top of that lobe. In this particular case, it's called the arcuate artery. And then it's going to radiate into the cortex. Remember, the cortex was a different color as it goes all the way around, and then the medulla, which is the middle portion. So it goes into the cortical radiate artery, and then it's going to go into the afferent arteriole, which will bring it through the glomerulus, and I'll show you the return trip. So here's what they're talking about. Not a great picture, but here would be the arcuate artery, here would be the cortical radiate artery, here would be the afferent arterial, here would be the tuft of capillaries, which is called the glomerulus, and it's going to then come out through the efferent arterial. That's this A is with the afferent, E is the efferent one. Okay, and then we're going to go backwards so that you can see that as we go back, it's going to go through the blue portion here, which is the cortical radiate vein, into the arcuate vein, into the vein that's between the two pyramids, and that would be the interlobar vein. Remember, there is no segmental vein, and it goes right into the renal vein, which would then bring it into the inferior vena cava. And if you remember, the three places to go into the right atrium are the superior vena cava, the inferior vena cava, where this one would go into, and then the coronary sinus. So the trip of following it is simple. If you just think of where Ben would be going, he's going to come in through the abdominal aorta, into the renal artery, into the segmental artery. Then he's going to be in an artery between the two lobes, and that's going to be the interlobar artery. He's going to go arcing over the top, which is the arcuate artery, and then radiating into the cortex, which is the cortical radiate artery. He will then go into the afferent arterial, go into the glomerulus, which I'll have to show you in a few seconds, and then he'll make the return trip through the efferent arterial into the cortical radiate vein, into the arcuate vein, then the vein between the two lobes, which is called the interlobar vein, and then directly into the renal vein. So it's just a matter of being able to follow Ben from place to place to place. And this particular chart here really shows it really well. It's just a matter of memorizing, going from place to place to place. So a nephron is the structural and functional unit that forms urine. You have over 1 million of them per kidney. So everything that I just showed you, or will show you in a second, is times 1 million plus on each kidney. So the nephron is consisting of two parts. One is the renal corpuscle, and the other one is the renal tubule. The corpuscle consists of a glomerulus, which is a tuft of capillaries, and inside of it are going to be fenestrated endothelium. So it's going to be very porous so that you can push stuff through it, and the stuff you're going to put through it is going to be blood. So at this particular time, the fluid going through it is called a blood filtrate. And then as it gets pushed through this glomerulus, the glomerulus is inside of something called the glomerular capsule. And the capsule, which used to be called the Bowman's capsule, is cup-shaped. And inside of it is going to be this glomerulus. When you're thinking about this, you're going to have two different layers. The visceral portion is the part that clings to the capillaries, which is part of the glomerulus. And the parietal one is going to be made of simple squamous epithelium that is going to be on the inside of the Bowman's capsule. And so by having that process, you can filter the blood. And here is the third thing that you're going to have to memorize for this thing. So remember I talked about the blood. So the blood is going to go into the arcuate artery. It's going to go into the afferent arterial, then into this tuft of capillaries here. And then as it goes through there, it's going to push it through all of the slits and the podocytes and everything. And then the rest of what we're going to do, or the third part of memorizing all of this stuff, is as you leave the glomerular capsule, there is this part here, which is called proximal because it's right next to it, and convoluted tubule. So convoluted means it's a little bit twisty, and tubule is just a little tiny tube. So this particular apparatus times 1 million in each kidney is what's going to filter your blood. So as the blood gets filtered through this fluid is now going to go through the proximal convoluted tubule. We're going to leave the cortex. We're going to drop down into the medulla. This thing to me, which is called a nephron loop, was the loop of Henle when I went to school. And it's going to go from the cortex into the medulla, into this portion here, that is the middle portion. And as it goes through here, it's going to have a descending limb because it's going down. Then it's going to actually make the paper clip loop, which is called a nephron loop. And then it's going to start going up. And that's going to be the ascending portion of that limb. Then although this is not exactly in the way it really would work, this part here is going to actually be in this part right there, and that's called the distal convoluted tubule. Let me just go ahead to show you the picture that is actually accurate. Ahead. And here it is. Okay, so we have this glomerulus here, glomerular capsule. Coming out of it is going to be the proximal convoluted tubule. Proximal because it's right after the capsule, convoluted because it's twisty, and tubule because it's a little tube. It's going to have a descending limb, then it's going to be the actual loop of Henle, and then it's going to ascend. If you notice here, the ascending portion is going to be between the afferent and efferent portions of the vessels going into the capillary. So here is the afferent. It's a little bit wider than the efferent because it's going to have a little bit more pressure to make the blood go through this glomerular capsule. And then there's going to be sensors, and one of the sensors is going to be, here is the proximal convoluted tubule, and then this part here is going to be the distal convoluted tubule. In the distal convoluted tubule are these cells here, which are called the macula densa cells. These are chemoreceptors that are going to modify your urine or make some changes so that eventually, as it's going through this particular glomerular complex times a million in each kidney, you are modifying your urine so that when it leaves your body, it's just going to be waste products and water. And that's basically what urine is made out of. Let me just go backwards for a couple seconds. So the macula densa cells, as I mentioned, are closely packed cells in the ascending limb of the loop of Henle, and they contain chemoreceptors that check the sodium chloride content of the filtrate. There is also juxtaglomerular cells, or JG cells, or granular cells that are there too. These are going to be responsible for acting as mechanoreceptors to sense blood pressure. So if you go to them, these cells here and here on the afferent arteriole are the cells that are going to monitor the amount of renin that will be secreted out. Okay? In any given day, you should probably have about 2 liters of water, or fluid is probably the word. But only about 1.5 liters of the 180 liters, we'll just round that up to 2 liters, that you're going to take is going to be creating urine. So you are going to probably use about 1% of the fluid that you intake as your waste product at the end. The interesting thing is your kidneys will filter your entire blood volume about 60 times a day. And doing that, it's going to consume a lot of oxygen because even at rest, you're still creating or having blood flow through your body. So urine is going to be produced from the filtrate, as it says here. And it's less than 1% of the original filtrate. But what you're going to secrete out in urine is going to be the stuff that your body doesn't need. If it's something that your body does need, there's no sense in wasting it and have it go down the toilet. So when you think about this, how much glucose should you have in your urine? Hopefully you're thinking, oh, you shouldn't have any, because if you do, you have a disease which is called diabetes. How much blood should you have in your urine? And hopefully you're thinking none, because that is the correct answer. If you have blood in your urine, that means there's something wrong somewhere. How many white blood cells should you have in your urine? Once again, you should say none, because you shouldn't have any white blood cells in your urine, because that's usually indicative of some sort of urinary tract infection. That doesn't necessarily mean you're dying, it just means you need to make your urine a little bit more acidic. And the processes in this physiology portion, which we don't do in the lab portion, are these 3 processes. Glomerular filtration. It produces the cell and protein-free filtrate. What that means is everything goes into the kidney and they're going to push everything into that glomerular capsule, and then selectively return 99% of it. So anything that's glucose originally gets pushed into that glomerular filtration, but you're going to reabsorb it back. Meaning anything that's good, you don't want to have it in your urine. You don't need glucose in your urine. That means something's wrong. You don't want blood in your urine. That means something's wrong. And the same thing with proteins and also white blood cells. So the tubular reabsorption means it's going to take the stuff that has been secreted from one section into another section, and then we're going to make it go back into your body because it's going to be a good thing. Tubular secretion will selectively move substances from the blood to the filtrate in the renal tubules and the collecting ducts. And so what your kidneys can do is modify some of this stuff. And it does it, as you look at this thing, here is the afferent. It's a little bit wider because it's going to have the push coming through here. And as you look at some of these things here, this is the filtering system it has to go through. And so in the vessel itself, it's going to have little holes, which are called fenestrations, which are the pores. And then it's going to have foot processes of the podocytes. It's going to have slits between them. So as you think of this, and if you think of like a wine press, you got to get rid of the stems and the seeds and the stuff in the wine, and then as you're pushing it through, that's what these glomeruluses or this nephron is going to do times a million in each kidney. And so it works pretty well. Here's some of the things that it looks like it's doing and some of how we just... So some of the things that you need to know is anuria is going to be less than 50 milliliters of urine a day. And it could mean something is wrong, renal failure, but it could be that the nephrons are stopping functioning. So you can have it like a bad blood transfusion, crushing injury of one sort, or acute nephritis. But we're just going to deal with the parts, not necessarily how the parts work. And I'm going to work my way backwards just so you can get an idea of how this works. So this is probably a good picture because this is going to be the afferent arteriole going into the glomerulus, and then as it pushes or filters all of the blood through here, you are going to then go into the proximal convoluted tubule, which will dip down into the medulla and also through here. So most of what you're going to have happen through here is the absorption of water, and that's mostly what urine is made of. And then we're going to modify some of that a little bit down here, which is between the afferent and efferent arterioles, and the macula densa cells are going to be responsible for a lot of that modification. Here is actually an electron micrograph of, this is what a glomerulus looks like. It looks like a whole tuft of cells put together, and you're going to have the afferent one in here, and then a much smaller efferent one. Now think of this time, and it doesn't even say what power that's at, but think of 1 million of them in each kidney. And then one of the things that's going to happen is as you filter, let's get to this one, as you go from here, remember this part is going to be over here, and you go through the distal convoluted tubule, each one of these little branches go into the collecting duct. And so at the end of the collecting duct, which would be right here, is going to be the renal papilla. And the fluid that comes out at the end of the collecting duct is called urine. So once that fluid has left the collecting duct, this is the very first time that the blood filtrate is now called urine. And if we go back to our original one here, you can see that all of that takes place here in the medulla, and at the end of this tip here is going to be the renal papilla. You've now filtered the blood as much as you can, and the fluid that comes out here for the first time in the minor calyx is now called urine, and then it would go to the major calyx, the renal pelvis, the ureter, and then into the urinary bladder, and that's it. So really there's 3 things that are going on: the flow of urine from As it leaves the renal papilla at the end of each one of those lobes and leaves the body, the blood flow going into the kidney through the renal artery, the segmental artery, the artery that arcs over the top, and then all of that, and then all of that's going to take place out here in the medulla, and then from the medulla into the from the cortex into the medulla is where you're going to have all of that filtration takes place. And that's the end of our urinary story. Let me just stop it for 1 second and go ahead to the next slide and just explain that one. So although not much has worked in our stuff from Carolina, let's get rid of this one and use this one. Urinary system B. Slideshow, begin. Okay.
You were talking about Carolina.
I was talking about Carolina. So, for those of you who did get the box from Carolina, you'll notice that there is a strip to test your urine. There is fake urine in there, so you don't have to worry about that. It's too bad. I usually have the class use their own urine. And it's always interesting because we can find someone in the class who has a urinary tract infection. Not that you want to have a urinary tract infection, but so the urinalysis is one of the things that we would do in the lab. Unfortunately, some of you still haven't gotten it, but so urinalysis will check for signs of a disease. And so it is just a little strip that you urinate on, and the strip can be read to let you know what's happening. So the first thing that can happen is it can check for glucose. Glucose shouldn't be in your urine, so that one will turns really, really fast. You shouldn't have proteins in your urine. You shouldn't have ketone bodies or bile pigments or red blood cells or white blood cells. So if you look at this chart, if you find it in your urine, here could be the possible cause. I'll just pick the two extremes. If you have glucose in your urine, it probably is an example of diabetes mellitus. So you could either have it from birth, which is called diabetes insipidus, or you just have too many little debbies, in which case you are having too much glucose in your urine. The other extreme here is white blood cells in your urine, and it can be from a urinary tract infection. So those are the two that we usually see when we do the strip in the classroom. For those of you who have never looked at your urine, it should be clear or a yellow-ish color, and it can be some weird colors. So the abnormal colors could be brown or smoky. There was a student I had a year or two ago who had green urine. It's like, what the heck's up about that? And she said, well, I'm on an antibiotic, and her urine looked incredibly green. I left it out for a little while just because you really don't see too much green urine. So if it's a yellower one, it could be due to B vitamins that you might be ingesting, or actually clear to pale yellow is a normal color. If it smells, let's say your power went out and everyone's still urinating in the toilet and you don't flush for a while, it starts to smell slightly aromatic. It develops an ammonia odor upon standing, and the bacteria metabolize the urea. It can be altered by certain drugs or vegetables. So any of you who might be a vegetarian, you might have urine that's a little bit different than other people. In addition to that, if you have a disease, it may smell very acetone-y. As a matter of fact, the old doctors used to dip their fingers in it and lick the urine. And if it tasted fruity, you had diabetes. Just something to think about. Fortunately, we don't do that anymore. It'll show it up on the little strip. A urine The pH of the urine is slightly acidic, and that's going to be responsible for destroying bacteria. Remember, our bodies don't like bacteria at all, and so if you have an acidic diet, so it's a lot of protein or whole wheats, it can cause a drop in the pH. And if you're a true vegetarian, or if you've been sick, it can give an increase in pH. So rather than being somewhere around 6, it might be up higher, 7, 8, 9, something like that. Where if you got slightly acidic urine, it obviously would be less than 7. The specific gravity depends on what kind of solutes you have in there. The specific gravity of water is 1. So you can have a range from 1.001 to 1.035, which is normal because that's the urine, which is mostly water, and the solutes that might be in it. The ureters are going to be the slender tubes that convey urine from the kidney into the bladder. And if we had, this is what the slide would look like. So this is a slide of the ureter wall, and this would all be transitional epithelium. The white here is going to be the ureter, and that's going to be the lumen of where it would be. And then you're going to have, in this particular case, the transitional epithelium that's going to be around the ureter. Some of the other things that we have seen in the classroom, some people might have kidney stones, and they could be crystallized calcium, magnesium, or uric acid salts. Some of the stones can get so large that you have an incredible amount of pain and pressure. And in a lot of cases, what they may have to do is do something called lithotripsy, where they use shock waves to shatter the crystals inside of your body. There is another portion here, and as the ureter comes down into the bladder itself, it's going to have the 2 openings here, which are going to be here, and then the 1 opening that's going to leave it. And so it makes a triangle, which is called the trigone. The trigone of the bladder is usually the pooling area, particularly if you can't get rid of the urine, and there'll be bacteria that could be there, and that's why you want to keep your urine slightly acidic. In this particular case, you are going to have the urine go into this holding area, then it's going to go, in this case it's the male, and we're going to do that with the next lecture that I give you, and the tube will go from there to the outside of the world, and that's going to be the head of the penis. But as it goes through it, it's going to go through this gland here, which is called the prostate, and it's called the prostatic urethra. Then it's going to go through the urogenital diaphragm, and so it's now called the intermediate part of the urethra. And now it's called the spongy, and it used to be called the penile urethra. And so with a male, if you have bacteria, it's got a long way to go back into this pooling of urine in the trigone of the bladder. And so here is the female. So that doesn't have all that length. Here is the one entrance from the ureter. Here's the other entrance, or the hole from the ureter. And here is the bladder neck, and this would be the urethral opening. And it's a very short distance. So with females, particularly as a little girl, if you don't wipe from the front to the back and you wipe from the back to the front, there's a lot of fecal coliform bacteria that can be introduced into this trigone, and that's usually where you would have an infection. Like the stomach, the bladder also has all of this rugae in there, and the rugae are going to allow it to stretch to accommodate a large fluid volume. So the rugae will expand and can rise superiorly during filling without significant rise in internal pressure. But at some point, you can only hold a certain amount of urine. And as it says here, it holds about 1 pint. And then you got to go pee really bad. And that's basically everything that we'll be talking about. Anything else that we're going to talk about, I'm going to do in the male reproductive system, which will be in the next lecture after that. So that's it for tonight.